Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Nikki Hill.
And me, Tom Parkin. Thanks for joining. And if you can, tell others about our show. The audience is building, and your word of mouth really does help. Now, we usually like to start the show by talking about a couple of interesting and important items that aren't national news headlines. But this week, we're going to touch on one that definitely did hit the national headlines. MP Lori Idlout crossing the floor from the NDP to the Liberals. Then Nikki's going to help us understand some really fascinating, weird dynamics in the Vancouver mayor's race. I know you're going to, this is going to be good stuff.
Where BC politics in some ways always weird.
Elections in October, right, Nikki?
Yeah, October,
yes.
Great. And then we have our feature interview today with Guio Jacinto, who is the Economic and Trade Policy Analyst for the Canadian National Office of the United Steelworkers Union. We're going to talk to Guio about how major job sectors are holding up against tariffs and how Canada's economic strength can be boosted.
Okay, but before we get to Guio, let's take a look at this week below the fold and some above. Okay, Nikki, well, given who we are and the kind of interests that I think people come to this show because of, I didn't think we could just skip over MP Lori Idlout's floor crossing from the NDP to the Liberals. Lots to unpack in that. First, floor crossing. We saw an Angus Reid poll last week showing only 26% supported floor crossing. 22% say it would be okay for an MP to leave the party on whose ticket they got elected and go sit as independent, but 41 said no. If you leave your party, you need to go to a by-election. So it's not a popular position. So while Mr. Carney is creeping closer to a majority using floor crossing, is he also maybe eroding his brand as an honest player, as somebody with, who is above board, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a wild week in Canadian politics, but I think, some of these floor crossings have been in discussion for months, obviously. And I think it's like the goal of the floor crossing. I'm actually fascinated that so many Canadians care about floor crossing. I got to be honest. Sometimes it feels like inside baseball for those of us in politics. And obviously, you have the personal pain when it happens in your own party. But I think the other thing, like, I'd want to see here in terms of how the public talks about floor crossing is also, I think, what we're seeing Carney try to do, which is get that stable majority government at these strange times. So, it's hard to say, I think, at this stage, if the public penalizes him for having encouraged all of this floor crossing to get to that majority in a time when I actually think people are looking for some certainty and stability.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting contrast, dichotomy, contradiction in a way. And I don't think, my own opinion is, I don't think he's going to get immediately punished for it. But I just wonder whether it becomes part of a way they see Mr. Carney as a bit of a, private boardroom operator, and then other ideas can get tied to that. We had Don Davies on the show talking about, lack of principles on Trump and Iran, for example. So it just becomes kind of a shiftiness, a pattern that gets established. Anyway, the second thing, Poilievre. So where does this leave Mr. Poilievre if Mr. Carney can achieve a majority? Some polls are putting him in the low 30s. And these by-elections are coming, 3 of them. The Conservatives are not particularly players in them. Yeah. But, of course, it's public record how they did last time and how they will do this time. So people will be looking for any vote slips. Carney gaining majority gives Poilievre time to change how Canadians view him. And it relieves some of the embarrassment of propping up the Liberals on confidence votes. But on the flip side, does a Liberal majority now weaken his ability to suppress any Conservative Party caucus insurrection that might arise against him, because the threat of we can't afford that right now, guys, because there could be election any day, that argument's disappeared.
Yeah. And I think we see, like, their caucus has not been hesitant to remove other leaders when there's that sign where they are maybe not going to win the election. Like, obviously, Poilievre's got the base of support to hold on longer than some of his predecessors here. But I think what's kind of fascinating on this front, too, is we can see Poilievre trying to change the way he interacts with the public, what his sort of image is here on issues. And I sort of think it's like it's an interesting case in seeing when you spend so much time building into a particular
mm,
brand, which has been that
mm,
kind of punchy, populist, like slogans, kind of a little bit of into that leaning into that clickbait sort of style. Can
yeah.
you actually recreate yourself as a politician into being what I think people are looking at? I was reading something in a
Oh,
progressive publication about carny mania. I mean, I'm not certainly in that category, but it's such a difference in leadership styles that it could be really hard for Polyev to come back in comparison to a Mark
mm.
Carney.
Yeah, he's never been anything but that populist for his entire
Yeah,
career, and he's been there for 1,000 years since he was 22,
yeah,
something like that. And so ask anyway, it just seems like a very tough task to now convince people you're
yeah.
somebody else.
Completely
Yeah,
someone else, and I know it's very serious times, so I think
yeah.
the public's looking, carny mania in Alberta is a wild thing to
And
consider too, right?
and here's just one other thought along this line is he was brought to the leadership as a uh, convoy conservative.
Yeah,
There is a strong, you still see it, you see it right now in the BC Conservatives election
yeah,
race, right? The
yeah,
leadership race. Very strong streak of that in sections of the Conservative Party.
yeah,
If he goes to Mr. Nuance, Mr. International Travels, and thoughtful intellectual of the center right, what happens to those people?
yeah,
Do they stick around and say, well, listen, I thought we were here to, attack trans kids, and talk about wokeism and blah. I
yeah,
mean, do they stay with
yeah.
the project?
What's I think, like, the timing of the BC Conservative leadership race too, because I think,
Mm,
we're in about 85% of the 9 candidates are leaning into that far-right,
that
rage-baiting sort of
that little space.
Polyev populist,
Uh-huh.
and sometimes somewhat because they've got some of Polyev's advisors and campaigners coming into
Yep.
BC, driving some of, the clickbait here. So, but
Hmm.
I'm fascinated to watch as this leadership race goes by in the sort of the same timing as we can test out Polyev's popularity to see if the public's still there with these types of tactics, because it is it really is leaving out a big portion, I think, of voters who are more in that center right to
Yep.
lean into, but also,
Yep.
I don't know, the public is so inundated right now with negativity, with uncertainty. I'm not sure that politicians who drive that message with them are going to have the long time
Mm,
rewards and support
mm,
here.
mm. Okay, and let's finally touch here on what this means to the federal NDP, who is the party that lost the member here. So now, Nikki, feel free. My analysis here is going to be a little bit not very happy. So feel free to tell me that I'm being overly pessimistic. Okay, please do. In fact, but maybe I'm not. I mean, it seems to me this departure should be ringing loud alarm bells for NDP members who are in the middle of a leadership vote right now about what is at risk here. I don't know why Lori left. I'm not going to kind of try and speculate what's in her mind, but I do believe 100% that if the NDP was united and was at 18 or 20%, the likelihood of her leaving would have been a lot lower.
Hmm.
And Jack took over a party in a similar state to the one
Yep.
today. The federal NDP is a fragile coalition, I would argue. It's a coalition of some very successful provincial sections,
Yeah.
the labor movement, and various ideological hues along the left, from center left to left. Jack was kind of a master at stitching those pieces together, and delivering, ultimately holding that coalition together, tightening it up, and delivering results. But since him, the stitching has come apart again. That's what my 10-year experience has
Yeah.
been. So the leadership balloting is open now, and those with strong ranking commitments have probably already put their ballot in.
According to
But for
social
those,
media, they all
yeah,
it's like
but for those
wild.
still,
Never seen
yeah,
it.
but for those still mulling it,
Yeah.
it seems to me that they should be screaming for candidates to demonstrate that they can stitch this coalition back together again.
Yeah.
And even with Lori leaving, I am not sure that party members, and again, maybe I'm being just, Debbie Downer here or whatever, Tom, the terrible, I don't know. I'm not sure that party members see the serious situation the federal NDP faces, and therefore the horrendous turn this country could take, given the historic importance of Democratic Party in federal parliament has had on this country, even though it's never governed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come in a little more Pollyanna here, and it's not just
Okay.
because you tossed me that space. It's because I think I really dig into, and I've been thinking about this in the leadership race, and also thinking about this as a member
Mm,
myself, and what I'm looking for
mm,
from candidates, and what they're
mhm,
talking about, and partly
mhm,
because I do tend to focus my own candidate support around people who are going to be able to do some of this, and have organizing background, and can think about this coalition space. So my Pollyanna actually, though, comes from the very immense privilege I had of being one of the 10 people left in BC with a job
mm,
still after the BC government
mhm, mhm.
folded in 2001, went down to 2 seats with 77 liberals in
Yeah.
government. So I think, like,
That was quite the privilege, Nikki.
I'm
To,
quite the privilege to still have a job in a little tiny team with 2 MLAs. But I
right.
think,
Yeah.
if we think about that time, I think that actually
Yes.
gives me the experience in saying, because, by 2003, we elected Carol James as leader. We had spent a lot of time in the rebuilding phase. It was an extremely painful experience to rebuild. People hated us.
Hmm.
We had, we'd
Hmm.
go to events and table and try to sign up members and have people throwing things at us, like, no lie. So I think, like, I dig into the fact that if we can rebuild after 2001, when we lost the BC election, and then in 2004, Jack Layton was elected leader. I often say Jack wasn't Jack when we got him. He had a
No.
really strong background in organizing. I got to work with him really closely in that rebuild of the party as well. And so I think where Jack leaned in, and what we, came to see as Jack Layton as a leader, but also in that rebuilding of the party nationally, it was elbow grease, and it was doing the work,
Yeah.
and it was constant, and he made us all work really hard for those wins, but because he was leading from there. So that's kind of what I'm looking
Yeah.
for in a leadership
Yeah.
candidate is they can't do
Hmm.
it themselves, but they need
No,
to
no.
bring together across the country people who are going to lean in with them, and bring back, I think, some of what we've
Yeah.
lost, which
But
is that local capacity, and
okay,
people who are in the mission.
I like your a little slightly happier mood than my dourness on this one,
Maybe because I've
but
been through so much pain, Tom.
but I would argue the federal party is a little bit more difficult machine because of provinces and provincial sections. That adds a layer of complexity that doesn't exist within any particular province. It just becomes more difficult. But I would say, and I would very much agree with you about Jack, he did grow into that.
Yeah.
But I think that the essence, and I, being someone from Toronto where he was a city councillor or once ran for mayor, what I always thought about Jack was he always was trying to get points of agreement, not points of
Yeah.
disagreement, trying to find points of agreement. So he, as we saw, when he became the leader, he kind of was a moderate mainstream social democratic party leader. But he always had feelers and friends in the left of the party,
Mhm.
and who supported him and he trusted him. He had folks in the labor movement who knew him well.
Mhm.
And he had built a network across the country, of course, through his leadership of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So that was a benefit as well. He had those contacts. So it just strikes me that it's that piece of reaching those pieces of the coalition and finding the points of agreement where we can go forward. And if I could ask, the leadership candidates to do one thing, it would be in these last weeks to show me that you can do that, or that you're committed to doing that and can carry out that mission.
Yeah.
I'd love to
I'm
see
just
it.
going to throw in there, though, as a BC
Yep.
person, I think, and who
Hmm.
supported Jack for leader. I did so on the basis of, like, the 3 people in BC who knew who he was from FCM.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of space to grow here, I
Right.
think,
Right. Right.
as a
Yeah. Yeah.
non-Toronto person.
Yeah.
There's back to
Okay.
my positive.
All right. Well, we've taken up too much time on this negativity and positivity debate. But what we should talk about is you're going to you want to take us a little bit below the fold on the craziness of apparently Christmas Day drug dealing
Ooh.
city councilors. Tell us about this nutso thing.
Yeah, I want to start this from also, I was thinking this morning because this song is just like an earworm that, politicians need to be paying attention to AI and what is real and what's not. And I say, if you're a
Right.
BC politician, we have this ad on repeat, like on every radio, every TV show from our Securities Commission about AI being the demise of us all. And it is like, you can't get away from it. It's a total earworm.
Okay.
So I want to pass that, like, I think I'm social media connected to all the folks we're going to talk about. Pass on that lesson to politicians. Check your sources before you go out because you may end up in lawsuits. So,
Yeah.
it's interesting watching the Vancouver mayoral and council debates going on right now, and coalitions and parties forming right now. It's more interesting for me because this is really the first one that I'm totally sitting it out after, a couple decades of trying to
Hmm.
bring together progressives in Vancouver because we moved to the
Hmm.
suburbs just before the last one. So I get to take a pause and just judge everything everyone's doing. There is a lot going on here still in Vancouver, being, because Surrey and Vancouver are getting pretty close in size, biggest municipalities. And we will have multiple progressive parties on the slate, multiple mayoral candidates. So we'll have to get into those things in a different show. But back to the AI being the demise of politicians, particularly, I would say what we're seeing here is we have a sitting mayor, Ken Sim, and his party's called ABC. They only have been in power since 2022. So this is their first re-election
Hmm. One
campaign.
term. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've had they've had a couple people leave their party. They've had a lot of changes. We've had by-elections here where a couple more progressives got seats in Vancouver. So, there's a lot of shifting dynamics. And I think we've seen some polling lately that say that people want to see more progressive voters, more progressives on council in Vancouver.
Hmm.
And Ken Sim came in from this heavy business supported sort of this approach we sometimes see from politicians from the business community saying, they want to run the city like a business.
Yeah.
And again, back to where
We've had
we
that in Ontario, but he
have our
wasn't really a
rigors.
businessman. He was something
Yeah.
else.
Well, okay. Ken Sim, we can say, is really a businessman.
Different kind
So
of
he is
businessman.
running in October again, which I think there was a lot of
Yep.
question about whether he would go into that, knowing that his party has had changes. One of his
Hmm.
former
Hmm.
council members from his party is running for mayor as well. His former chief of staff is
Oh.
running for mayor against him.
Oh. That's
It's
not
going to
good.
be, yeah, I know. This Vancouver, as I said, will be
That's bad.
spicy. Maybe spicier than Toronto this time.
Yeah.
Maybe not spicier than Surrey. But it came to light a couple of weeks ago where Ken Sims, maybe he might decide not to run again, depending on the outcome of this. But one of his council members, Lenny Joe, who's with Sims' party, he claimed in a 5-minute video, so a long video, he put on WeChat, which is a really popular social media platform for the Chinese Canadian community, which is an important voting bloc in Vancouver and in different places in BC. So he
Mm.
did claim here that not just a couple, 4 opposition Vancouver councillors
Oh,
are drug users and distributors. So these are big issues in the Chinese
they're drug
Canadian
dealers.
community. So, you're
Okay.
accusing your
Yes.
colleagues on council, 4 of them.
Hmm.
And it was very widely shared because that's how this platform works. These counselors called for an integrity commissioner review. And then it turned out, as the media dug into this, that it was actually Ken Sim who was around behind the initial allegation here. And he had told a group of Chinese businessmen that a particular
He did
counselor,
it.
Sean Orr, that he'd seen a photo of him handing out illegal drugs on Christmas Day.
Okay.
The mayor's saying now that this was, a mistake. He should have looked at the photo source. It was AI generated. So,
Oh
back
my
to our
God.
lessons here for politicians. But
Sorry.
now
What an
Sean Orr,
idiot.
of course, has a civil claim alleging defamation, which I think we can all agree has happened here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I think,
Okay.
public
That's,
signs or
yeah. So
would
when they come to
say,
sue you, that can be your excuse,
yeah, I'm
Nikki.
sorry, not a lawyer, just play one sometimes. And so
Yeah.
this is going to be playing out now. Of course, this has only happened in the last week or so. The
Yep.
mayor's gone quite quiet on it. We'll see what he decides and how
Right.
it plays out. But, just back to that, heated political times here that you have to actually be accountable. And I think that's what we're seeing right now play out here is, you can't be going forth and making these sort of allegations about anyone, your colleagues in particular. And this is going to be a really heated election coming up here in Vancouver in October. It's not the only lawsuit that's been involved around Ken Sim. He actually last summer filed a defamation suit against that former chief of staff, Kareem Alam. Kareem's now running for mayor on a different banner against Ken Sim. So we have no shortage of dynamics going on in Vancouver for the upcoming
Crazy, crazy.
election.
Yeah, that's wild. That is wild. Okay, well, we're going to have to come back to that story because this sounds like there's a lot more in it. But let's take a break now. We're going to come back with our interview with Guio Jacinto from the Steelworkers Union, talk about trade and Trump and building jobs and stronger economy.
Donald Trump's war on Canada's economy continues, and our businesses with political assistance are scrambling to find new markets for our export goods. Some see a solution in a rapid increase in defense spending, some are focused on major projects. There's been less discussion on how industrial policy can create jobs in new sectors or build out sectors where we're already strong in Canada. We're lucky to be joined today by Guio Jacinto, an economist who spends a lot of time thinking about these issues in his role as the economic and trade policy analyst for the Canadian National Office of the United Steelworkers. Prior to joining USW staff in 2017, Guio was a production worker in the Bull Moose Tube, a steel tube producer in Burlington, Ontario, and a member of USW Local 1416. Thanks for joining us on this important topic today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. Thanks. The Steelworkers members play a key role in a whole bunch of important sectors in the Canadian economy. A couple of these, like forestry and steel, are under particular attack from the U.S. President Donald Trump and his campaign of economic force against our country. Let's just start by, can you give us a sketch of how workers in the sector are holding up especially in those two key sectors, against the pressure that's being put on their companies?
Yeah, certainly. So it's 2025 was a very difficult year, as you can imagine, for those sectors, and aluminum included. I would include aluminum with the steel sector there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just to give you a sense of the shock, the trade shock in the steel sector and aluminum sector. In 2025, exports to the United States from Canada, steel exports declined by about 31% or so, year over year, right? Comparing 2025 to 2024, that's actually slightly overstates or understates the loss, partly because there was a sort of a pulling forward of demand in the earlier part of the year as U.S. steel consumers tried to get ahead of the tariffs. So when you look at like the last few months and the last quarter of 2025, exports were down nearly 50%. December was 55%. And the trend in the steel sector, for example, there hasn't hit a bottom yet. So we're still seeing continuous declines month over month in exports to the United States. On the aluminum side, I think it's been a bit more resilient. We've seen pretty large declines year over year as well, about 25% or so in terms of exports to the States. But there's certainly been a plateauing in terms of export volumes. Like I never want to be the person that calls the bottom, but exports have sort of flatlined since mid 2025.
Canada has maybe a more commanding demand in the marketplace, does it not? In steel rather than
certainly
aluminum rather than steel.
Yeah, no, it does. And the U.S. is quite dependent on our semi-finished aluminum. And one of the differences with the aluminum sector and the steel sector is that there's much more sort of diversification possibilities with aluminum, which is not the case with steel. And you have seen that aluminum suppliers in Canada have been able to diversify away from the U.S. I think the export share going to the U.S. at the beginning of 2025 was something like 97% of all exports was going to the U.S. By the end of the year, it was around 67, 70%. So there was some, in terms of like diversification of exports, that's clearly happened in the aluminum sector. Forestry's been in an ongoing crisis for some time now. So, the forestry sector has been facing anti-dumping, countervailing duties for some time now, about 35%, and the Section 232 tariff on softwood at the end of the year adds another 10% to that. In terms of export volumes, we saw a decline. I think it was about 9% of wood products to the U.S. And there's also some evidence of diversification as well away from the U.S. So it's been a tough year in terms of employment. I think the average employment numbers in the steel industry from StatsCan mark that employment's declined about 1.4% approximately.
Mhm.
Aluminum's been pretty stable. Forestry about 1% as well. We've seen losses in the steel sector. We've lost three steel mills, not in the primary sector, but sort of further down the value chain. My plant that I came from, unfortunately,
Mm,
closed last year.
Hmm.
And in total, that's about, if those plants were operating at full capacity, that's about 400 jobs or
yeah.
so. And then we also had the accelerated job losses at Algoma. Um, and again, that's not just sort of mention we have thousands of members that are on work sharing agreements with their employers and the federal government through the EI program. Aluminum, like I said, it's been a bit more resilient, but forestry, again, some employment losses there. I think we have about 1,700 members laid
Hmm.
off in that sector.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'm in BC. I don't know if we said that. So yeah, the forestry sector dynamic is a hot topic
Yeah.
here, and how to deal with some of those losses. So on the jobs front, so expanding on that, so Stats Canada reported on Friday we had the February employment rate rising zero point 0.2 percentage points. So that's over 110,000 fewer jobs than December for the February stats. The majority of that job loss is actually in Ontario, where there's 60,000 fewer jobs in February than December. So, of course, unemployment does weaken our country. It's, as we sort of still continue focusing on fighting Trump, it's that doing so with one arm tied behind our back here. But a lot of where we're seeing the federal economic agenda, it won't show up as paychecks for months. Even, major projects in provinces as well can be counted into many months away, if not years. So can we be moving faster? What's the cost of not really centering this battle for in our economic gains on creating jobs and full employment in your mind?
Yeah. Those are two good questions. In terms of the job numbers, like we have been seeing a progressively deteriorating labor market. I think that's 2 months in a
Hmm.
row now of employment losses. So employers
Yep.
are shedding labor, right? And I believe the labor force contracted as well. In terms of the costs, the costs of unemployment are myriad, but primarily, right? I mean, higher unemployment, less output, we could produce less. But there's also long-term effects of unemployment, right? I mean, um, the longer folks are out without jobs, their skills get eroded. They become less employable. There's a professor down in the U.S. Her name is Pavlina Cherneva, who's a labor economics professor. She has a quote that says, unemployment breeds unemployability.
Mm,
And that's very much true. And what we've
mhm,
seen in progressing, if you compare 2025 with 2024, you've seen the share of those that are in long-term employment over 27 weeks grow quite significantly
mhm,
year over year. So uh, definitely a concern and something that we don't want to see. I think on your first question of whether we could go faster, I think this is an interesting question. It's a pointed one in that I think it really touches at the heart of the federal government's strategy to stimulate the economy, which is very much premised on
Mm.
crowding in private investment, right? So the
mhm,
function of how fast we go really depends upon how fast private capital and the private sector crowd in crowd in and add on to all the money that the government's investing in the economy.
mhm,
And my concern with that, or at least my question, isn't necessarily questioning whether or not crowding in is real. I believe it is. I think it's a core premise of heterodox economists. So I certainly believe with that. So that's not my concern. My concern really is whether what the government has done so far, whether it's enough, and
mhm,
whether we need more, and whether the medium through which they've done it is sufficient, right? And to give you an example, and just to sort of focus that a little bit more, the question really is whether or not um, the private sector feels uh, what the government is doing has, materially lowered the level of uncertainty, whether
yep,
or not it's incentivizing private investors' animal spirits to invest, right? And when you look at the data, for example, in 2025, like we had 3 consecutive quarters of declining core business investment in non-machinery, in non-residential
Yep.
investment, machinery, intellectual
Mm.
property products, right? We hadn't had that since, the pandemic, and just right before the
Uh,
pandemic. And before that, it was the oil price crash in 2015, right? And all those produced,
yeah.
had recessionary outcomes. So, um, really the question is private investors, does the private sector feel comfortable enough that what the federal government is doing is enough for them to, engage in private investment? Um, so far, I don't think that's the case. There was a little bit of a rebound in Q4 of 2025. That's certainly true, particularly on that core business investment. We'll see if that remains the case in the first quarter of 2026. Um, but I'm not convinced. I mean, my perspective really comes from the steel sector, right?
Hmm.
And the government has made $5 billion available through the strategic response fund, which is the former strategic innovation fund. A
Yeah.
billion of those was carved out for the steel sector,
Okay.
um, to make investments in retooling and focusing in different product markets, which they had done to now. And so far, I mean, we've heard a lot of chatter in the public, but so far, no private sector proponent has taken up any of those
Yeah.
funds or used those funds, right? So
Mhm.
there remains a lot of uncertainty, right? At the end of the day, there remains a lot
Hmm.
of uncertainty, and there likely
Yes.
will remain a lot of uncertainty. And really, the question is, is what the Carney government done enough, and whether or not they need more sort of serious or stronger state-led action or public entrepreneurship to really change the direction here.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into that a little bit down here. I don't know if these folks are unionized or if it might be steelworkers, but I did see the newspaper story that made me think about some folks in coastal BC working the sawmill. The sawmill, sorry, it's not a sawmill. It's a pulp mill,
Okay.
and the pulp mill closes, and now the raw logs are getting shipped, loaded onto boats, and sent across to somewhere else to be turned into, I guess, pulp, because that's probably what the kind of trees what they're good for. It seems to me that a kind of a premise of the Trump plan is to have Canada ship raw logs, or to ship rather than ship lumber, or to have Canada ship metal ingots rather than ship steel. So how do we have pressure points, leverage points, where we can push back to do the exact opposite, to try and ensure that value-adding jobs are getting that this, we all know that we're blessed with resources in this country,
Yeah.
but are we doing the manufacturing part here, and how do we pressure that and keep these chains in Canada? Because as Mr. Carney and many others, everybody else has pointed out, when these chains now loop through the United States, it it increases our exposure to foreign pressure.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. There's a few points there. I think in the immediate context of the trade war, well, first of all, I just want to take your analysis there. I verbally agree with your analysis and diagnosis there of Trump's trade policy. That's
Yeah.
how we view it at the Steelworkers. And when we present to our members, we sort of take a phrase from that was popular among certain Canadian economic nationalists in the 1960s, when they're in the 70s, when they were dealing with the Nixon 10% tariff, which was Nixonomics equals the deindustrialization of Canada.
Hmm.
Similarly, Trumponomics equals the
Hmm.
deindustrialization of Canada. So I completely agree with that framing. In terms of the immediate context of the trade war, I think the leverage points that we do have, and again, looking at it from primarily the Section 232 sectors, steel and auto particularly, uh, the counter tariff strategy that the federal government embarked on under Trudeau
Hmm.
was continued in a certain way by Mark Carney, I think has been really important. It's been there's a bit of a pause there, and a large sort of horizontal remission in the steel sector, where U.S. steel was allowed to come in tariff free for a while there,
Yeah.
and I think there are legitimate reasons there for that. However, but in large part, um, those tariffs, we did see a decline in imports coming in from the United States, U.S. steel, and that opened up some tonnage for Canadian mills to repatriate. Similar, I think, in the auto sector, the counter tariff strategy there, in conjunction with the import production import sort of scheme that they have that operates there, I think has been a really important factor in the tug of war over the sort of continental auto industry. So I think in the short term that those measures have been super important in just defending our productive capacity and defending our product capabilities.
Mhm.
But clearly they're insufficient, right? Like we do need other additional industrial policy uh, interventions and tools to expand our productive capacity further downstream in these sectors, steel, I would say in particular. Um, Again, the strategic response fund, I think, is a good tool that could be used. And I think, sort of broadly, I guess, stepping back from the immediate context of the trade war, I think, um, sort of going back to your framing, I do think that the Trump administration does want to, lower Canada's industrial structure to a lower value-added base, right? I think that's definitely part of the strategy.
Mhm.
And we've never really done. I don't think we've ever really fully exploited very well our natural
Yeah.
resources
Maybe never
in
done a great
Canada.
job to begin with, and it's
Yeah,
left us in the situation we're
yeah,
in, and
that's
now
right.
it's maybe going to get worse.
Yeah, no,
Um,
definitely,
that's,
definitely.
I
So
guess,
yeah, we've really missed a sort of conscious, sort of state-led, whether provincial or federal strategy that really seeks to maximize, the forward linkages beyond the raw material extraction, and further
mhm.
develops in the processing, whether that's the smelting and refining capacity. Right. And if anything, we've actually lost quite a bit in the last decade in that space as well. So we've gone backwards.
Mm.
Yeah, and so I think the other thing that's been a hot topic, we're only on episode 8 of of our show, and I think, every episode we're talking defense, because I would say that everything now is centered on defense policy for where we're at. We hear, things like wartime acceleration on policy from not only prime minister, but across provinces. So, it is logical that there's the reason that we're rapidly adding into the defense sector here. But of course, really complex issues in terms of what we're adding in, who we're working with, because Canada is not currently preventing products that are being built here being re-exported to do for war crimes and genocide elsewhere. So we're going to dig into that in a future show and not going back. But what we wanted to talk a little bit on this with you is about that massive injection of public investment into spurring jobs around the defense sector. And here, with if investment is ending up more with U.S. companies, U.S. jobs, where's the benefit there around our sovereignty, or is it continuing to subordinate us to America, like we just talked about a second ago on some of the other natural resource factors?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think in the immediate short term, I think there's inevitably going to be a leakage of public funds going to
Mm.
supporting foreign
Yeah,
imports and foreign arms makers that are largely originating from the United States, right? And I
yeah.
think that has a long historical reason. Our defense production sharing agreements that we signed in the immediate post-war period, but also I think it's fair to say that there's been a sort of generational underinvestment in our defense industrial base for a long time, right? So I think it's a kind of a
Hmm.
function of those two things. I do think the defense industrial strategy that the federal government outlined does strike a pretty fair balance between um, trying to maximize industrial benefits and defending Canadian sovereignty. I think the strategic procurement philosophy that's outlined in build, partner, or buy um, does a fairly good job of ensuring and maximizing domestic industrial benefits while defending our sovereignty. I mean, and I just want to point to a few cases, like in
Mm.
the build portion, like there is an emphasis of sort of picking capabilities where we have already some domestic capacity, right? Investing and
Mhm.
scaling up those measures, whether that's in munitions or land armored vehicles,
Ships.
naval ships.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a big one.
aerospace systems as
Yes.
Yeah.
well, right? So there's a clear sort of industrial policy objective there to create national champions. I think they even use this
Mhm.
phrase explicitly of
Hmm.
Mhm.
national champions, right?
And the
That
provinces are leaning into that too.
yeah,
We're
exactly,
seeing that.
right.
Yeah.
Which I know you'll see a lot of. I mean, particularly coming from the steel and aluminum sectors, that'll
Hmm.
generate a lot of demand for those sectors if they pivot towards the metals in those sectors. So I think in that portion it's very clear. Even in the partner portion, where in the section where for military products that we can't produce or have insufficient capacity, or rather that we have insufficient capacity. The objective there is to partner with like-minded allies under the form of joint ventures and joint production, right? And I think the example of the grip in here with Saab probably falls under that category, and it's probably one that I'm looking at pretty closely, because I think there you have kind of the benefits of both sides, right? You get strategic autonomy from a military perspective. You get strategic autonomy with your own endogenous fighter, right? And on the industrial policy side, you get an advanced manufacturing, a so-called what we call Indian industrial policy space, and an advantageous industry that is high R&D, high technology, as well as creates a lot of manufacturing jobs, right? So I think that's a good sort of model, and I think the real clincher for me was even in the buy portion, and I think the submarine RFP that's out right now is a good example of this. Even in instances where we can't produce, we just don't have the domestic capability to produce, like submarines. There's been an explicit attempt by the Ministry of Industry to tie any funds that are, if we're buying from South Korea or we're buying from Germany, there's an explicit attempt to capture industrial benefits, whether it's leveraging Germany to create an auto plant here, right? I mean,
we saw that.
We saw that,
with
right?
Korea, right? We saw that.
Yeah. Well, with Korea, with Korea, we saw the agreement between Hanwha, who's the project proponent, and Algoma, right? And if that deal happens, then Algoma gets a structural mill financed by Hanwha, right? And also producing elements for the steel that's going into the submarines. So, like on the whole, in terms of like if we're looking at the industrial benefits of the defense industrial strategy and whether builds our sovereignty and our capability, I do think it does a good job on that front. It is really a case of, I mean, there's nothing new here, right? This is military Keynesianism 101. But it is military Keynesianism with Canadian characteristics, right? Like the Carney's announcement yesterday in Northern Canada, right? There's $40 billion going up there, largely to secure the ARC by building bases, but it's also going to build transportation infrastructure, hydroelectric power, right? So we're seeing military Keynesianism with some developmental effects there as well, which I think are positive to a large degree.
And as you say, sort of starting from behind on a number of things. I mean, and as you would know too, labor movement's been really active in BC on not being able to meet some of the shipbuilding contracts that were coming up from the BC government, right? Like that's been shelved for a while. There's a space to build there, but it is that, how do you get those industries now up and running when they couldn't even feed into some of that domestic demand and RFPs?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. We had NDP interim leader Don Davies on last week, and one of the points that he made was that Canada often loses control of the outcomes of the research that's done here, either privately, universities, or of that sort, and it ends up being owned by businesses where the innovation gets applied somewhere else. So when we look at our R&D number, it's never been strong, and we complain about it. But we keep losing our intellectual property. Do you see a similar pattern? Do you agree with that analysis? What do you think is at the root of it? What do you think needs to change so that we get the full advantage, full benefit of the incredible intellectual power that Canadians have and inventiveness that we have to power the innovation and the productivity of our own workplaces?
Yeah. No, definitely. I think I would certainly agree with that assessment. I do think the issues aren't sort of at the innovation sort of side of the equation. Like we do have a pretty strong record of innovating new products and processes and et cetera. It's always been on the sort of the other side of the equation, which is scaling up these sort of startups, the commercialization of whatever the innovation is, right? And I think that's really where the gap is, and really that gap in between the two is the question of financing and risk, right? And who's going to take the risk? And the reality is that in the U.S., venture capital pools and risk capital pools or capital that's more prone to engaging in risky investments is much bigger than ours, right? And so I think that for me is probably the key ingredient here. I think the defense industrial strategy touches a little bit on this, but more on the defense industrial side of it, the question. So we could do a much better job providing public financing The Business Development Bank of Canada would be probably the best institution to to operate in this space and to support small, medium, and even startups to scale up their operations. Um, and really fill that gap that's missing.
Mm. Yeah, I remember a little period, maybe 15-ish, I guess it would be around maybe even the dot-com bubble era, where Kitchener and Guelph in Ontario was a real hotspot of tech innovation and an incredible number of new patents coming out. And big U.S. tech companies bought them. In some places, they just fired everybody, took the tech and used it in, Silicon Valley. And we kind of weren't any further ahead than, I mean, I guess we are. I'm being overly grim, but it certainly felt like, some great Canadian inventions were taken away. But I guess the question, Gil, is like, it's about money, right? If somebody sees a great innovation and they are they are Microsoft, they got, $50 billion in innovation purchasing power every year, say, I don't know. How do we try and have companies aligned with public sector, to even challenge that buying capacity, to take and repatriate the tech to their own country?
Yeah. I mean, like in addition to sort of beneficial or on the financing side that the public could sort of engage in. I mean, government procurement is also a very good way of sizing up and scaling up these smaller firms and providing them with the revenue that they need to reinvest into their firms, right? And so I think that's so far been a very much an untapped source of growing domestic domiciled like Canadian companies. I'm hoping that the Buy Canadian procurement policy, definitely assists with that process. But I do think your sort of larger question of ownership is also important, right? I mean, again, not from sort of tech innovation space, but from the steel sector. I could tell you that the Canadian steel sector, primarily when it was largely Canadian owned, was a site of both product and process innovation, right? It was like the Stelco and Hamilton invented the coil box, which just an innovative way of coiling steel coil that comes off the line, right? And once we saw a lot of these firms sort of being opened up to foreign ownership, what we saw was not process or product innovation. What we saw was essentially, the stripping of assets and the stealing of order books, right, from a number of foreign-owned companies. So I do think the domestic ownership piece is also important in this conversation.
Good point.
Yeah, thanks for all of this. I think we could probably spend hours, obviously, on these topics, and we appreciate you coming in with your knowledge. And I would say too, like we're continuing to see, of course, that in polls and public opinion, that we are like the public's still very dialed into jobs in the economy as the top pressures right now for them. So we probably will need to keep diving into these, and may need to bring you back on to talk a bit more.
Certainly, for sure. Yeah, I'd be happy anytime.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Guio.
All right.
Appreciate your time and your insights.
Take care. Nice to meet you, folks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, so interesting interview. I can imagine that the steelworkers super challenged with these problems and worried about how their industries succeed in the future. The questions that really resonated for me were, though, about the future and how do we try to protect this country of ours, our economy, to make sure that we can generate the jobs that we're not going to turn into the drawers, the hewers of wood and drawers of water that it seems like Mr. Trump wants to turn us into.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I think for me, it was actually some of the thinking about the past and how we get here, right? That not having that history and industrial strategies of the value added and making sure that we've built out into those sectors. I think about it heavily in BC, and I come from a resource sector family as well, and that's crashed over the years. So I think as we look at, we'll have to bring someone on to talk BC forestry soon too, because I think that's a great example of where some of the harm from the past means that the sector can't meet the jobs goals and what we talked about in terms of those mill closures.
I remember, if I'm correct, Nikki, at one point allocating rights to timber was tied to having an on-site sawmill, and the BC Liberals took that away. So this is a way of, killing our manufacturing base. Some people don't think of sawmills as manufacturing because they're from Ontario and you think cars and steel.
Yeah.
But it very much is in Northern Ontario, in Quebec, and in BC. It just doesn't seem like
those long-term strategies aren't in place, and we're suffering from them now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we've been these debates too around, conservation and use of trees, and it's like I think everyone agrees that if we're harvesting trees and you hit some of those conservation targets too, if we're actually using the products in a way that create jobs.
I know for a fact that here in Ontario we're well behind the amount of lumber that can be taken while meeting the conservation goals. So because the industry is in a lull, and it's never been. It's like BC's got a very, very strong industry. Ontario is relatively small, despite the massive size of this province. But at any rate, we got to do a whole show. The lumberites will be after us.
Yeah, we'll be on it.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back with Love It or Heave It. Okay, before we wrap up, we're at that part of the show we like to call Love It or Heave It, about something we love and want to keep, or something we'd like to heave and forever forget. Unpopular opinion, maybe, but I am heaving the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto this week. I went for the first time in many years recently and did not see a museum with a sense of purpose or that made any attempt to bring us the artifacts that tell us our own story. There's a small exhibition about China. There's one about gems and metals around the world. There's furniture and silverware of British aristocrats. It's all beautiful stuff. I mean, it's very lovely, very interesting. But what's the connection to Ontario? I don't understand it. There's a single room about Indigenous people, but it barely tells a story. It's a mishmash of artifacts from the Niska in the west, the Micmac in the east, but nothing about Indigenous villages in the Great Lakes region. No artifacts about their contact with the earliest Canadians. No artifacts about how that contact played into the other contacts between French and British colonials, and how that led to a global war, or how the American Revolution and Indigenous nations, French and British, all played together for the loss of the Ohio Valley, or the gain of the Ohio Valley, to the United States. It didn't mention people with big names like Isaac Brock or Tecumseh or Brant or Pontiac or Blue Jacket. I mean, these are people who, are supposed to be icons of our history, but we don't know who they are, and they aren't represented in our museum. How can that be? There wasn't anything about the invasion of Upper Canada in 1812. Well, there was a very, very small exhibit on that. And I mean, it wasn't an invasion in which Toronto, then New York, was attacked, captured, looted, and our parliament buildings burnt to the ground. Kind of significant. Might have an artifact around for that. I don't know. Or it doesn't touch on the rebellions of 1837, where 300 or 400 people died in shootouts. I mean, this is, kind of warfare. Not mentioned. And that's just a beginning. I just think when tourists visit this city, they don't want to learn how culture, they're not going to learn how our culture developed. And it's not a place where I can go, or anybody can really go to learn about it. So I hate to do it. But I gotta say, we deserve a lot better than what I saw at the Royal Ontario Museum last weekend.
This week we're giving love, and I think a lot of people are giving love to what is being called the perfect press release. Some may call it the GOAT of all press releases from last week. So as we've talked about on this show, rage baiting on reconciliation is so high on some social media platforms. Yeah. Particularly in BC. And I think some of the players are losing the plot here in their attempts to get views, including Conservative MP Aaron Gunn. So he posted on social media tying land acknowledgements to private property rights being a huge debate right now in BC, particularly with the BC Conservative leadership race going on, and with a number of new agreements and decisions being brought into this discussion. So I just want to read out, though, this fabulous, I think, press release release that people across the country have been sharing from
Yeah.
the First Nations
All
who
right, let's hear it.
are sitting on the territory, or who Aaron Guns sits on the territory, his riding here, of these First Nations. So after that tweet, the press release says, chiefs from 4 First Nations communities are urging the public to please approach Aaron Gunn with no caution whatsoever. He is completely harmless, though momentarily unsettled by the alarming possibility that someone might acknowledge the land before a meeting. Yesterday on social media, the MP appeared to crash out and demand to speak to the manager of land acknowledgements, a position that observers confirm does not exist.
Okay.
Chiefs whose territories make up the riding had 2 words for the MP: chillax, bud. Land acknowledgements have never seized private property, canceled a mortgage, repossessed a pickup truck, or altered a single title deed anywhere in Canada. They are simply people recognizing the history of the
banks have,
place
though.
where they are standing. No one's going anywhere. And I love this part.
Okay.
Canada
Yes.
will survive the brief moment of honesty. Until then, chiefs across the region continue to reassure the public that land acknowledgements have not to date resulted in any land back.
Yeah,
So
all right.
there we go. I think it is hard sometimes to keep light of issues around reconciliation, generally hard to keep it light because they are so serious, and they are, as we've talked about, resulting in anti-Indigenous rhetoric and hate. But I think these folks did a great job, and everyone is dying to know now, I think anyone who works in communications, who wrote this brilliant press release.
Yeah. Well, that is really that's really funny, and in a way, what I gave a heave to and what you're loving here, there's a connection because it's this idea that there's a culture of not knowing our past, and it creates a space for disinformation and distortion because we don't have the facts. We can't know the difference, but it also creates the possibility of these like breakthrough moments, like a press release like that gives you sudden clarity, and of course is funny at the same time. And anyway, it reminds me of one of our villain here, Steve Bannon's beliefs that politics is downstream for culture. So to change politics, you have to break the culture, and certainly MAGA's working on that one. But Nikki, makes me wonder whether the opposite is also true, or something like the opposite. That breakthroughs in clarity that deepen a culture or put the culture more in touch with its true history anchors Canadian politics. Anyway, just a thought. Thanks for joining Left, East to West this week. We'll be back next week.
Thanks for joining Left, East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We'd love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left, East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left, East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left, East to West. We'll see you next week.